Hello, I'm Dr. Paul Mattis, and in this session, we're going to talk about how did the Virtues and Character Development Project come about? What's the story behind it? What did God do? And to see this, I want to give you some of the major events that have taken place as we've moved forward. In April of 2024, God began to lead toward developing a new project. At the starting point, the main idea, the main focus was developing resources that would be used with college students to help them develop habits that are virtues that would lead to a second nature in them. So it would be just something they would do because of who they are, and that would lead to a good or godly character. Now, God then used several discussions with family members and friends and colleagues over the next several weeks to broaden the range of the ages of the students, eventually to include all the way from age 5, which would be the ones that when they're first starting school, through age 25 when they're finishing with their professional or graduate education. Now, God directed conversations over the next several months to clarify the purpose of this project. In particular, it became evident that the resources that were to be created needed to be targeted toward the parents, the teachers, the church leaders, anyone who's going to work with the students, instead of targeting the students themselves. Furthermore, dissemination of the resources needed to go through churches, Christian schools, homeschool groups, any group that would be providing or have parents that would be able to work with the students. And all these resources then were determined to be available in a digital format for download off our website at no cost to the end user. To accomplish the goal of producing materials that could be used with the students in the various settings we've described, an organization was needed. God brought individuals together for conversations that initially revealed several teams would be needed. First, a board of directors, then an advisory team, and finally, a planning team. The board of directors would be responsible for the operation. The advisory team would be responsible for making sure that anything that's produced remains true to the mission and that the resources actually were practically useful. I know that we often come up with good ideas, but when you try to implement them, they don't really work. So part of the advisory team is to address that issue. Then the planning team would be the primary group that would be creating the activities that would be age appropriate for each of the different age groups that enable virtuous habits to form that would lead to godly character. Now, across the summer of 2024, other elements were developed and added. A statement of beliefs was created so everyone joining the project would understand the view of God that's central to this work. In addition, a position statement or the perspective behind the project was developed. Now, much of the thinking for this statement comes from a paper written by Jennifer Hurd entitled The Virtues, in which she connected the biblical foundation with virtues, character, and human flourishing. And then finally, a Google Drive was set up for the organization that enabled us to archive the documents they're creating, as well as having an email address that could be used. By the end of August 2024, the project was an official organization that was registered with the state of Ohio as a nonprofit organization under the name the Virtues and Character Development Project. The next step was to apply to the United States Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, for tax-exempt status. By mid-November, approval was granted and notification was received in less than 3 weeks. The speed with which these steps occurred confirmed God had been opening the doors for his work. The Virtues and Character Development Project is now a tax-exempt, nonprofit organization that will continue to grow and expand in the coming days. As conversations about the work continued across the fall, colleagues whose native language is not English volunteered to translate all the resources into their mother tongue. Presently, there are 8 languages identified, with more expected in the future. As a result, a translation and culture team was added to the project. This team obviously is responsible for the translation, but they're also assessing the materials that are produced as to whether or not it would work in that particular culture. So we get feedback before we put it out there so that the local people will be getting something that's useful in their own culture and their own setting. Then the need for other teams was identified across the months. The first one is a prayer team that will focus on praying for the work, and the requests that are sent to the organization by people who are using the resources that were created, and praying for families that are using the materials that it will really transform the lives of their children. Second, an assessment team will be needed to evaluate the effectiveness of the resources. That's not yet in place. We're in the process of putting that together. And finally, the third task that was needed is the identification of families, churches, Christian schools, and homeschool groups that would use the materials and test them to make sure that they are functionally viable in a way that's actually beneficial. God has also brought other volunteers into the organization who explain the need for online activity through a website, social media, and podcasting. Work with several consultants brought about social media accounts with LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. These will be tools to communicate with interested individuals of insights about virtues and character development, as well as announcing when new resources are going to be available. In addition, a logo based on the symbol of a bonsai tree was created to have a visual reminder of the need for character development. You know, a bonsai needs to have a good root and good conditions to grow well, and needs trimming throughout its lifetime. In the same way, person with a character in the process of character development needs to have a good root, Christ, and support through that. And that's the idea that we're talking about in this project. As the project was moving forward, it was clear that podcasting would be necessary. However, expertise in this area was lacking. Again, God provided direction. While attending a professional conference in April 2025, I was given the task of facilitating a session that focused on the first steps to take to start a podcast program. In addition, a colleague with extensive experience in creating podcasts was attending the same session. After the session finished, we discussed further what's needed in the development of podcast programming. This is just another example of how God is working to move this project forward. The official launch occurred on June 14th, 2025, when a virtual meeting of the volunteers was held to share the vision that God has laid before us. The organization structure, programming, responsibilities, and timeline was shared. Several suggestions from the volunteers were given that will help us in putting together a progress that will be much more beneficial. The website was published online in August of 2025, and the release of the first resources, the module on humility, was released in 2025. We're anticipating adding a new module for a different virtue every 3 months as we move forward. In conclusion, this project presently is focused on creating resources that will enable individuals to develop habits, meaning virtues, that will lead to godly character. These will be made available to those who are working directly with the students. This will include working with churches, meaning pastors and teachers and parents, and Christian schools, administrators, teachers, and parents, homeschool groups, and institutions of higher learning, administrators, teachers, parents, staff. It's evident God has been working to bring this project into being. In just 17 months, this idea has been brought to life, and we're actively making this available to anyone who would like to help their students grow in godly character. Thank you for listening.